I came to UGA in a plane and a car. I'm kidding. Okay, so how did I come to UGA? Well, I got to tell you, I did graduate school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I chose UNC Chapel Hill for grad school because I really wanted to work with Bruce Winterhalter, who was my advisor, and it was his interests and his specialty in hunter-gatherer studies is what got me there. And really, almost from the beginning of graduate school at UNC Chapel Hill, I knew about this department, the Department of Anthropology at the University of Georgia. Why? Because I was studying to be an ecological environmental anthropologist, and the best department for ecological environmental anthropology was and is and has been this department here at the University of Georgia. So I knew all about, I knew graduate students from here, and I knew faculty from here, and it was definitely on my radar. I was very lucky right after I got my PhD that I was able to be employed at Ohio State University for a couple of years, and I learned a lot there. And then when I saw that there was a job to apply for here at the University of Georgia, I jumped at it, and luckily they hired me. And that was in 2005, and I've been here ever since, and it's really worked out great for me. I've been able to do exactly the research and the teaching that I wanted to do, and it's worked out great. It's made me very happy. Me and my background. Well, I guess I can tell you that I kind of grew up in the very boring suburbs of Ohio and in Georgia. And, you know, I kind of always knew that the world was more than what I could see around and what I was being taught, and the world must be more interesting than all the boring things that were present in my very limited world. And I remember when I was like 11, there was like a community pottery studio down the street from us in Columbus, Georgia. And the guy who ran it was sort of an after school kind of thing, or a thing that you do on weekends and or summer vacation kind of thing. But the guy who ran the community pottery studio, his name was Mr. Dodson. And he was really interested in Native American pottery from archaeological settings. And when I was like 11, he had this like field trip, and we went to Cartersville, Georgia, and to Etowah Indian mounds. And I remember that was the day that I was just like, wow, this is like right here where I live in Georgia, there used to be pyramids. Like, how cool is that? Like, pyramids aren't just in Egypt. You know, that they're here too, and there's ancient cultures here that lived, and people lived on this very land in ways that are very different from today. And man, I'll tell you, it was like, I remember that moment now as when I wanted to become an anthropologist, because it was just so fun to think about the world being so much more than the boringness of shopping malls and parking lots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, not everyone like find their aha moment where they get to know, like, you know, what they want to do, and you were lucky to find that. So tell us a bit about like what do anthropologists do, and specifically like what do cultural anthropologists do?
Well, so what cultural anthropologists do, I think a big part of what any anthropologist does is imagine. And to me, there's a little bit, you'll find that a lot of, not all, but a lot of anthropologists are also science fiction fans and fantasy fans. And the reason is because there's a similar skill set of trying to imagine different kinds of worlds or different kinds of ways of living. And for cultural anthropology, we're really lucky because we can go and visit those places. We don't just imagine them from remnants of things like archaeologists do, but we go and actually visit and talk to people and meet people. And the thing is we don't know in our own society whether we're doing things right or wrong. And, you know, some things work and some things don't. But if you don't have a larger idea of what it means to be human, you know, thinking about all the different ways that people could live and do live, then you're missing a lot. I'll say too, I mean, I think the real I might be jumping ahead in your questions, but the real sort of significance of anthropology. There's so many different ways to live. There's so many different kinds of people out there. And a lot of people in the world today and in the past, their stories aren't known by us being the people with money and buildings and the privilege to write about the world. And if anthropologists don't go out and learn about people that are different from those around us, then the urban world just makes up stories about them. And most of the stories they make up are totally false, like that there's primitive people out there, or that there's backward people out there, or that we're more advanced and other people are more backward. I mean, all those are fanciful ideas that don't do credit to people. So the job of a cultural anthropologist is to go out and actually learn, how do people really live? What are people actually thinking about? How do they understand the world that's very different from the way that we do? So it's exploring that difference.
Yeah, and specifically like in the context of the world like we are living in, where migration has changed the world, globalization has changed the world so much, and these differences are becoming much more visible now than in the past.
Yes.
So can you talk about your research, like what do you do, and what's your research focus?
Oh, absolutely. So I've been really lucky in my anthropological career. Early in my grad school time, I went to grad school at UNC Chapel Hill. And early in my grad school time, I heard one of my professors said that that he had a buddy who was starting a project in Madagascar. And they wanted to know if anybody wanted to go. And I was like, yeah. And it was specifically a project to go work with hunter-gatherer people. And up until that point, I thought I was going to be an archaeologist because I was really interested in people who live by hunting and gathering. And I didn't really think I could do that with living people. I didn't think I could study living people who hunt and gather. So, I had that opportunity to go to Madagascar. That's where my research has occurred for the past 25 years. So I'm what one might call an economic anthropologist. My original training was in evolutionary behavioral anthropology, and I still write in that mode sometimes. But in a larger sense, I'm interested in how do rural people who live outside of urban areas, people who live in what we sometimes call the developing world or the underdeveloped world or the third world or the global south. I'm interested in how do people who live, who actually have to get food from the environment, how do they make their decisions and how do they make their livelihoods? And so originally I wanted to work with hunter-gatherer people, and I did and I do. But since then I've started to work with their neighbors as well, with farmers and with fishermen. So I do a lot of stuff that's a comparison of economic decisions and ways of thinking between those three ways of making a living.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about like human differences, and then you talked about like how you work on economic decisions.
Yeah.
So how does your research help in furthering our understanding of human culture, like in general?
Well, I hope it helps. I hope that my research helps us understand a human difference in human culture, specifically in the economic focus. If you take an economics class here on campus, and no, I'm not knocking economics. I really like economics. I really enjoy it. But you're only going to learn about economics the way that we do it. And you might learn that economics is capitalism and that other forms of economy are not quite mature or are capitalism in disguise or other things. But what my research has really tried to explore is, well, I mean, how do these rural people in Madagascar, how do they value the things that they produce and they buy and that they sell? They're very involved in markets. That's true. That's a similarity with here. People in this part of Madagascar, they've been using money for centuries. This is not a new thing. Markets are not a new thing. And part of what my recent research has really explored is kind of the role of culture. And there have been a bunch of studies recently that are sort of use experiments or things to try to look at different ways of making economic decisions in different cultures, but I kind of felt like they didn't go deep enough into the real pith of the meaning of what cultural difference is about. So a lot of my research now is sort of about, you talk to anybody who works in Madagascar, anybody who's been to Madagascar, Madagascar beliefs, Madagascar ontology, if you will, Madagascar concept of how the world works is it involves ancestors. And ancestors are everything. Ancestors are what give your life meaning. What's the point of being alive? Is it to earn a lot of money and buy a lot of shit? No, it's not. The purpose of being alive is to serve your ancestors, is to continue what your ancestors started centuries or millennia ago, and to make new people, and to make new people that carry on your ancestral tradition. The belief is that the ancestors are always watching you, they're always judging you, and you can't always know what they're judging you for or how they're judging you. There's some mystery to it all. So a lot of the choices about what crops you grow, what prey you hunt or gather, how do you handle those prey? A lot of those decisions involve trying not to anger the ancestors, and they involve trying to stick to a strict code of taboos and to behavior. And this is the kind of thing that economists often miss if you're just looking at things like marginal utility or, I don't think economists deny that those things are out there, but that's not their focus. This is what an economic anthropologist can bring.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about this economic way of living, ontologies, Madagascar and ontology. And anthropologists generally spend a lot of time on field, working closely with people. So how do you see biases in doing that research? When we establish a lot of familiarity with people, relationship with people, what role? How do we overcome our own biases?
Yeah, so our own biases are always there. And in the same way, earlier I said that I like to study, I was searching for the right word. I said that I study how people make a living in, and I struggled for the right word, and I said, is it the developing world? Is it the third world? Is it the global south? Another word for the world in which I am doing my research in Madagascar is the post-colonial world, right? This is a world that was colonized by France and still, in very many ways, is colonized by Europe and America and other places with money, China. And so my bias and sort of the colonial bias, they're always there. They're always there. But there's a lot more going on than that. So I kind of like to say that it's sort of like the Eiffel Tower in Paris. If you're in Paris, the Eiffel Tower is always there. It's always looming over you. No matter where you go, you could see the Eiffel Tower. But a lot of what you do on a daily basis has nothing to do with the Eiffel Tower, right? It's unrelated to it. It's always there, but it's not everything. And so the way cultural anthropology involves living with people, getting to know them, building relationships that last a long time. During my last field trip this summer, I saw a very good friend of mine. Her name is Medea. I met her on my very first day of field work in 1996. She's maybe a year or two older than me. And we've, built a relationship over all of this time. She's like my sister, and she refers to me as her brother. And, it's not about, I don't know, my research is not unbiased. There's no way to get around bias. And your bias can work for or against you, in a sense. I'll say too, I do really believe in science as a tool of learning, and not only anthropologists find that useful, but I do really believe in scientific sort of intellectual devices, things like having a large sample, having a representative sample, trying to think statistically. And to me, those are ways to try to ground truth things that I think are true. the way human minds work is we tend to think about like, well, the most remarkable story you hear is the one that you remember the best, and then you tend to think that that's representative, right? So if I hear one really remarkable story of ancestors haunting somebody because they made the wrong economic decision, I might think that that's a very common occurrence. But you don't know unless you actually ask a large representative sample of people, like, is this a common occurrence? Well, how common is it? How often do people think about it? Does everybody think about it? So for me personally, and the anthropologist, this is part of what I love about anthropology, is that we have different ways of trying to find meaning or truth or fact or theory. And some of us, for myself personally, I find the scientific methodology very useful for trying to get past what I think are the most noticeable things to try to test whether or not larger samples of people agree with that or find that also to be meaningful.
So over the past few years, there has been a lot of push towards scienticization of knowledge and using scientific method. So how do you see this debate of like anthropology as a science versus anthropology as a humanity subject? And what do you think about like what sort of methods we use and how anthropology is also scientific?
Well, so I was in graduate school in the 1990s, which was a time that today we think back of that as the science wars, in anthropology at least. It was a time when science was really being questioned for its practice and its power. And it really divided the world of anthropology, and a lot of anthropologists who thought of themselves as scientists left the American Anthropological Association, and it's a rift that hasn't fully healed. And in my mind, it was a very useful, it was an incredibly valuable debate, the debate about the limits of science. And science is extremely limited, right? So here's the thing. Among the limits of science are that we often kind of invent things as concepts in our heads and then assume that they're real. If we talk about social capital enough, we start to think that social capital is a thing that you can go out and you can see it. There's social capital. And, at a deeper level, we don't know if my social capital and your social capital are the same thing, right? I see this a lot in many different kinds of research. We just decide something's real. We decide that reciprocity is a thing. We decide that reciprocal altruism is a thing. We decide that kin-based corporate descent is a thing, and then we see it because we've already decided that it exists. And part of what we learned from the so-called science wars of the 1990s is that we need to look at, well, why do we think those things exist? Why do we assume that that humans throughout the world are naturally divided into tribes or ethnicities that govern themselves, that have chiefs or other people who govern themselves? That's a very colonial way of looking at the world, and we reproduce it, we make it happen by believing that it happens, and then studying it and looking for it in the world, and then going back and writing books about parts of the world, and then the people that we write about read the books we read, and then they think that that's also the truth. And in other words, science itself can be very limited if we don't do the deep experiential feeling and learning and being and exploring that a humanities side of anthropology brings to things. So personally, I think at this point we need to get beyond any divides between science and humanities and realize that they're both really, really valuable. And the way to learn about people is to do both. And I don't look at my humanities colleagues in anthropology, and anthropologists who have a more humanities focus, I don't look down on them or think they're doing things wrong. I think they're really contributing and adding to things. And I gain a lot of my questions from looking at what different kinds of anthropologists write. But then personally, my own role, I don't trust my judgment. I know that I have lots of biases. And I don't, when I'm doing ethnography, I don't trust that I automatically see things that are real or true. So my only way of learning about things is ultimately to go to to science, to go to large samples and think about representativeness and how many people have I talked to in this category of people I'm generalizing to, and what can I generalize to? Well, I'm just in the process of wrapping up a very large project, and we have a lot of data that has not yet been analyzed. One of the things that I'm really excited about from these data is we have some data that are looking at how people understand causality. So causality is basic cause and effect. And in a sense, the thing that I'm learning about causality is not all that unique, but it sounds like it is. All right, so we asked a lot of people, we asked a decent sample of people, what causes the rain to fall? And the part of Madagascar where I work is very dry. It's a very dry environment where the rain is extremely unpredictable. And some years there's no rain. In fact, there can be 4 or 5 years in a row with almost no rain, and then there's famine. And then 4 or 5 years with heavy rain, and there's flooding everywhere. So how do people make sense of that, right? Now, you can say that it's not something like, does the rain fall, does the rain not fall? You can say it's just random. Randomness is a very agnostic way of trying to explain causality, right? Randomness says there's no reason for it. It just happens or doesn't happen. Other ways you can try to explain it are in a very scientific kind of way of thinking about, well, some years there's El Nino years. The ocean temperature is warmer and there's more evapotranspiration. And some years the winds blow in this direction or that direction. Then there's other ways to think of it that you might think of are more religious. Like, well, some years God is angry at you. Some years the ancestors are angry at you. Some years that you've done the right things and the ancestors have blessed you. And what I found in the part of Madagascar where I work is that all of the above. People have all of those understandings of, just as we do, of causality. So you ask people, why does the rain fall? People will tell you things like, well, we've chopped down a lot of trees. There's been a lot of deforestation. You need trees to create, trees create fog, as people told me. And then the fog creates clouds, and then the clouds creates rain. That's what we would think of as a very Western scientific, natural cause and effect kind of chain of thinking. Or we, in Madagascar, in this part of Madagascar, people read the wind. They talk about wind all the time. Is the wind blowing from the north, the south, the east, the west? Some people have up to 7, 8 different terms for the wind. And that determines, different winds have a different probability of bringing rain. These are these are the kinds of things that meteorologists from the West would look at. Then they also talk about just simply probability. They say, they have words like kitai, which is an idea of just chance. Sometimes things happen, sometimes things don't happen. We're very familiar with these idioms. And then sometimes they talk about ancestors. Well, I've had people say the ancestors are very angry at us because we're changing our ways. We're forgetting our traditions. The ancestors then ask God to stop the rain from falling. And when the ancestors ask God to stop the rain from falling, God looks at the behavior of people and says, no, people are sinning and we need to stop the rain. None of these ways of thinking about the world are primitive. None of these ways of thinking about the world are wrong. And none of these ways of thinking about the world should be unfamiliar to us because we do all of these things. People in Madagascar do them in somewhat different ways, right? We might not think about ancestors, but we think about other types of, or we might, I don't know, but we think about other kinds of social change being a cause of environmental change. That social change could be, because we're destroying the environment, right? We're acting unsustainably, right? That's partially scientific and that's partially a moral argument. So I hope to publish something soon that actually lays that part of our recent research out. So that's part of an answer for you.
Yeah, and that would be very interesting if you get to read more of that. And that's such a global thing. Like if we travel around the world, like similar sort of things are common. Like if we talk to indigenous people or people living in those areas. So this is my last question about do you have any advice for young people who are interested in the field or in general people interested in anthropology? So do you have any advice for them?
So do I have advice for anthropologists, for people who want to become cultural anthropologists?
Yes.
Do it. No matter what opportunity you get anywhere, take any opportunity to travel, any opportunity to open yourself up to the people around you. The act of doing cultural anthropology is often an act of talking to people. And yet many anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, including myself, are introverts. We find talking to people, there are barriers to talking to people. It takes energy to talk to people. It's not that we're just naturally bubbly, loquacious people who want to talk to people. Many of us find it very difficult. But I think one thing that's sort of, I think, universal for very effective anthropologists is that they learn to be open, to be good at talking to people. Here in our world right now, we live in a world where talking to strangers is not normal. And I'll tell you, it's fun in our world, just like in the world of people in Madagascar. It's fun to try to break through that barrier. So you're in the the grocery store, you're in the checkout line. Strike up a conversation with the person who's checking out your groceries. It can be as simple as, wow, I like your hair, or wow, it's hot outside, or wow, it's difficult to stand all day, or whatever. And it doesn't take much to crack through the veneer of impersonality that we have. Get to know people as people. Take them seriously as people. I mentioned earlier in this interview, I talked about how a lot of cultural anthropologists are fans of science fiction or fantasy because cultural anthropology involves imagining worlds that are different from our own and are broader than our own. There's a great line from a Doctor Who episode where they say that all people are bigger on the inside than on the outside. And that's so true. And if you want to be a cultural anthropologist, never forget that all people are bigger on the inside than on the outside. It's so easy to misjudge and to categorize people and to say, I don't talk to people like that. I don't talk to people who put stickers like that on their vehicle or drive that kind of vehicle. I don't get beyond it. All people are people, and talk to them. Any opportunity you get to travel, take it. Any person you encounter anywhere, talk to them. That's how you become a cultural anthropologist. Is to go out and actually learn how do people read our
New coming. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you. This was fun.